Well, good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank very much indeed the organizers of this important event for the invitation to be with you today. Just a couple of words of personal introduction. I began my career as an academic in the field of political science and foreign policy. I then went to work for the European Union institutions in Brussels, where I had a brief pause of some 34 years in the institutions before returning to the academy, or rather to the think tank world. And the subjects that have interested me throughout this period have been foreign policy, international relations, European integration, and I've worked most on the transition of former communist countries to democratic political systems over the last 2 decades. During the last year, I was based in Washington, D.C., where I still am, at the German Marshall Fund, and we had a project that produced a report entitled Faith, Freedom, and Foreign Policy. And in this project, we looked at various dilemmas facing the modern world concerning the overlap between traditional foreign policy goals and objectives and the goal of promoting religious freedom and the protection of religious minorities. Through this work, in which I personally focused primarily on Europe, but comparing the European and the American experience very much, I was struck by the degree to which this topic has become prominent in recent times in most Western countries. The European Union, as well as the United States and Canada, have appointed senior officials responsible for the promotion of religious freedom. In the United States, there was the 1998 International Religious Freedom Law that posed the basis for this. In the EU, as Father Daly mentioned, certain guidelines have been adopted on these subjects to influence policy, and in Canada there is a similar initiative. Why is there this concern? To what extent can it be translated into effective policies, and what are some of the main dilemmas which it faces? I think the why is because of the increasing prominence of religious issues both in our own societies and around the world. We would need a whole symposium to discuss whether the political question about the role of religion is mostly about religion itself or about the instrumentalization of religion, as we've seen in many countries. But one way or the other, the topic has gained in prominence. A couple of decades ago, there was a warning from Samuel Huntington about the risk of a clash of civilizations, and I think it's the concern to avoid such a clash within our own societies. I speak mainly of Europe here, as well as in our relations with countries around the world that have influenced this increasing interest. And then, of course, there is the rise of various radical forms of religion, radical Islam in particular, but also the use of certain other religions, particularly the Orthodox Church, in the foreign policies of Russia and some of the former Soviet republics. The approach in general, if we take the United States and the EU as models, has been to set out certain principles about religious freedom, the protection of religious minorities, and then to establish a kind of mechanism whereby each year there's a reporting process, and both in Europe and in the United States, after extensive and in principle objective studies every year, a list is drawn up of countries of particular concern. And under the 1998 Act in the United States, and under the guidelines in the European Union, the executive authority, the President in the United States, the Brussels institutions in Europe, are expected to make proposals to withhold various forms of assistance and financial support to countries which are of particular concern, in the hope of influencing them. Now, there are a number of difficulties with this approach. First of all, there's the objectivity of the reporting, the sources of information, which in itself is a challenge. Then there is the question of which countries are included on the list. In the United States, the International Commission for Religious Freedom draws up a certain list. The State Department then analyzes it and usually comes up with a rather shorter list of countries. It's then up to the President, in principle, delegated to the Secretary of State, to indicate which of these countries should be the subject, for example, of withholding of financial assistance if they violated these principles. In the EU, something similar is underway. Putting it rather bluntly, this doesn't work. It's quite good for raising awareness, knowledge, understanding of the issues, but not really in influencing policy. Why doesn't it work? There are a number of reasons for that. First of all, because the goal of promoting religious freedom is a foreign policy objective. It's related to our fundamental values, but it's competing with other foreign policy objectives. And the other objectives are related to national security, access to resources, trade, investment, stability, and so on. And quite rightly, the Secretary of State, or the High Rep for Foreign Policy in the EU, the member states of the EU, the Canadian government, need to, in the interest of their citizens, take into account also these competing foreign policy goals. The results of this are, for example, that certain countries which are serial violators of fundamental freedom are excluded from the final list drawn up by the State Department, and in a notable case such as Saudi Arabia, ever since 2004, have received a waiver from the implications of being designated as a country of political concern because of other national security considerations. Something similar is underway in Europe. This, in my view, is understandable. Governments do pursue competing goals, but it's there, and I think it's something we have to reckon with. Secondly, there is a dilemma as to whether the whole subject of religious freedom should be hived off in this way to a particular administration, or whether it should be mainstreamed into all the policies that a government or institutions like the EU institutions should pursue. The United States, Canada, and the EU have chosen to set up a specific small administration and bureaucracy dedicated to this task. It's quite good in developing expertise and in raising awareness, but there is a certain tendency to say, well, this is being dealt with by those people, now we can get on with business as usual. So the dilemma between mainstreaming on the one side and including this policy area in diverse fields of activity, or setting up a specific administration responsible for it. I think we have seen the effects of this dilemma. Thirdly, another major and perhaps the predominant reason why these initiatives so far have yielded only modest results is because they are all addressed to states. The US Act on International Religious Freedom of 1998, the initiatives taken by the European Union, all have to do with the policies of states. And yet, the main threats to religious freedom and to religious minorities today come to a large degree from non-state actors. And we simply don't have a mechanism for dealing with that. In the European Union, which is the framework that I know best, dealing with states comes naturally. The countries over which we have most influence are the countries that have applied for membership. And there you can see a real impact in this field, whether countries in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, or indeed Turkey. The fact that countries have applied for membership in the European Union has given us the right to keep a very close eye on what's taking place in those societies, and even to stipulate, for example, in the case of Turkey, how non-Muslim minorities should be treated, the property issues related to Orthodox Christian foundations in Turkey, the very large non-Sunni Alevi minority in Turkey. We have actually been rather interventionist in the case of a state that has applied for membership, with mixed results, I would say. When it comes to countries further afield, we have to have a softer touch. as they would rather tend to challenge our leverage and our right to interfere actively in what many of them seem to be internal affairs. But if we look at the world today, the main problems in this area, I think, come from the rise of radical organizations, notably Islamic, but not exclusively so, where religion is a criterion for discrimination and even for violence. This is particularly visible, obviously, in North Africa, the Middle East, sub-Saharan Africa today, where there are extensive persecutions, where people are being treated with tremendous brutality only because of their religious affiliation. This has been clear in Kenya. You remember the dreadful incident in which people were taken off a bus, asked to recite a few lines from the Quran. If they could not, they were summarily executed. You'll recall also the case of the Coptic Christians from Egypt who were among workers in Libya who were picked out by radical groups in that country, marched down to the beach and beheaded purely because of their Christian affiliation. There are some 1.5 million Christians who've been displaced from Syria and from Iraq, and who form an important part of the huge movements of migrants about which we are reading every day, and which perhaps pose the leading challenge to the European Union since the decline of communism. In summary, therefore, I would say there are a number of reasons why the questions of religious freedom and the protection of religious minorities have gone up the agenda in the US, Canada, the EU, and other countries around the world. We have tackled it in a rather bureaucratic administrative way that I briefly described, with certain modest results. But now we face challenges which are so fundamental that I believe it's time to rethink our approach. Thank you very much.